This file was never supposed to exist. The USB drive arrived at my apartment in a padded envelope with no return address. Inside was a single folder, no label, containing one document. 47 pages, partially redacted, time-stamped across 4 days in a cold country winter. The author identified himself only as a federal field agent with a classification clearance I had never heard of. I spent 2 weeks trying to verify him. I found a name attached to a Department of the Interior subdivision that does not appear on any public organizational chart. I found a rental car booking in Morgantown, West Virginia. I found an obituary, dated 11 days after the last field log entry, that listed cause of death as a hiking accident. He was 34. He had no next of kin. What I could not find was any record that he had ever existed before the age of 22. I am reading you his words exactly as he wrote them. My name is Nathaniel Brooks, and before I tell you what I saw in that valley, I want you to understand something about the kind of man I was before I saw it. I was good at my job. That is not arrogance. It is the most important piece of context I can give you, because everything that follows is a story about a man who was good at his job, watching his job become completely meaningless in 6 minutes. I worked for a federal department that does not appear on any government website you have ever visited. We sit administratively beneath the Department of the Interior, which is a useful umbrella because Interior manages land, and land is where the things we manage tend to live. Our official designation inside the agency is Population Dynamics and Ecological Threat Assessment. My business card, which I have never once handed to anyone, says Wildlife Management Specialist. My actual job, the one I did for 9 years before West Virginia, was keeping the things that live in America's dark places from wandering into America's lit ones. You have a name for what we managed. Most of you have several. The people I worked with called them alphas, which is a term chosen deliberately for its neutrality. Because the moment you start using the words your grandmother used, you stop being a scientist and start being a liability. An alpha is a territorial apex predator exhibiting anomalous biological characteristics inconsistent with any cataloged species. That is the official language. What it means in plain English is that the thing in the dark is real. It has always been real, and for a very long time. My agency was the reason you never had to know that. We were not heroes. I want to be clear about that. We were middle management for a secret that was older than the country it was keeping. There is a postcard tucked into the sun visor of my truck. My daughter drew it for me 3 years ago when she was 7. It is a crayon drawing of a fish wearing a hat. She gave it to me before a deployment to the Cascades and told me it was a lucky fish. I have never taken it down. I do not know why I am telling you that, except that I want you to understand I had things. Specific, small, irreplaceable things. A lucky fish in a hat. A cup of bad gas station coffee at 3 in the morning that I had decided was actually the best coffee in the world because of where I was always drinking it. A job I believed in. The call came on a Tuesday. My regional director's voice had a texture I had not heard before. Something sitting underneath the professional tone that I would later identify as the specific register of a person who already knows the answer to a question they are not yet willing to ask out loud. He said, "West Virginia, coal country, Fayette County. Pack behavior inconsistent with any logged territorial pattern." He said, "We think the packs are grouping." He said it the way you might describe a traffic delay. Mild inconvenience. Manageable situation. I wrote it in my field notebook in the same handwriting I used for everything. I circled Fayette County. I did not yet know that circling it was the last ordinary thing I would do for a very long time. Fayette County in January smells like cold iron and old defeat. That is not poetry. That is the specific, physical smell of a place where an industry died and nobody cleaned up afterward. Coal slag does something to the air that I cannot scientifically account for, even now, a mineral bitterness that sits at the back of your throat like something you swallowed wrong. Hernandez noticed it the moment we stepped out of the rental truck at the trailhead parking area. 6 miles from the valley, our topographic maps were calling Dyer's Cut. He stood there for a moment, just breathing it in with his eyes slightly narrowed. And then he said, "You ever notice how places that used to kill people still smell like it?" I told him that was a disturbing thing to say at 6 in the morning. He said, "I'm a disturbing person. You've had 9 years to adjust." That was Hernandez. He had a gift for naming the thing in the room that everyone else had silently agreed to leave unnamed. In any other profession, that quality would have made him difficult to work with. In ours, it made him the best partner I had ever had, because our job required someone willing to say out loud what the evidence was actually suggesting, even when what it was suggesting had no business being real. We had been partners for 4 years. I knew his coffee order, his daughter's name, the specific way his jaw tightened when he was scared, but was not going to say so. He knew mine. That is the kind of knowledge that accumulates between two people who have spent enough cold nights in elevated positions watching things that would end a career to describe in a report. And the ranger station sat at the eastern access road into the national forest. A prefab building with a generator hum and a hand-lettered sign about fire restrictions that nobody had updated since October. The ranger who met us was a woman in her late 50s named Purcell. I showed her the badge that identified me as a Department of Agriculture Wildlife Services specialist, which is the credential we use because nobody ever questions a bored federal game warden. She looked at the badge. She looked at my face. She looked at Hernandez. Then she looked back at the tree line behind us, and something moved across her expression that she controlled quickly and professionally, but not quickly enough for me to miss. I asked her what the wildlife activity had been like in the past 2 weeks. She was quiet for just a moment too long before she answered. Then she said, "Nothing. That's the problem. Absolutely nothing." She told us the deer had moved out 3 days ago. Not the deer in one sector, all of them. She told us the coyotes had gone quiet. She told us a pack of feral dogs that had been a persistent nuisance along the southern fence line for 2 years had simply vanished without a carcass or a track to explain it. She told us this in the measured, factual tone of a professional describing observable data. And she kept her eyes on the tree line the entire time she spoke. When we got back to the truck, Hernandez pulled up the GPS unit and started cross-referencing our approach route against the topographic survey. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned the screen toward me without saying anything. There was a coordinate gap in the survey data, a roughly half-mile section of the valley floor that the GPS system was rendering as a blank. Not unmapped. Blank. Like something had refused to be measured. I wrote it in my field notebook. I noted the atmospheric temperature at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. I noted that the thermal scanner was reading the valley floor at 19 degrees. The valley was 9 degrees colder than the air above it. I did not write down what I thought that meant. Hernandez said it instead quietly as we started the climb up toward the crane cab. "Brooks, something is already down there." I kept walking. The coal breaker groaned above us in the wind, and the valley below sat in a perfect, waiting dark. The crane cab smelled like rust and old grease and 30 years of nobody. We had set up in the elevated operator cabin of a decommissioned loading crane, maybe 40 feet above the valley floor. The kind of position that gave us sight lines across the entire clearing while keeping us above whatever thermal signature we were putting out. The cab's windows were long gone. The wind came through without asking. Hernandez had the thermal binoculars. I had the scope mounted on the AR-10. We had been up there for 2 hours and 17 minutes, and the valley had given us nothing except cold and that persistent, bone-level wrongness that had been following us since the ranger station. Then Hernandez said very quietly, "Brooks." He did not say anything else. He just held the thermal binoculars out toward me without lowering them from his face first, which meant he did not want to stop looking at whatever he was looking at, even for the 3 seconds it would take to hand them over properly. I took them. I looked. The first thing I registered was the heat signatures. Plural. Dozens of them. Moving in from the northern tree line in a loose mass that the thermal filter rendered in overlapping blooms of white and pale green against the cold black of the valley floor. They were large. Even accounting for the way thermal optics flatten distance and scale, they were large in a way that my brain needed a moment to properly process. The second thing I registered was that they were not moving like a hunt. They were not fanning, not flanking, not running a pursuit pattern. They were walking, slowly, together. I counted. I lost count. I started again. I said, "How many are you seeing?" Hernandez said, "Too many. The optics keep recalibrating. I think..." He stopped. Then, "I think that is more than one pack." Here is what you need to understand about that sentence and why it hit me the way it did. Alphas are not pack animals in any conventional sense. A single territorial group will hold a region of roughly 200 square miles, and they will defend that region against every other alpha group with a consistency and ferocity that makes human territorial warfare look like a polite disagreement. I had personally documented 3 instances of inter-pack contact in 9 years. All 3 had ended in the complete destruction of one group. There was no framework in any field manual, any logged behavioral study, and any conversation I had ever had with any researcher in the agency for what I was looking at. There was no framework because the thing I was looking at was not supposed to be possible. I said, "That is the Cheat River Pack." Hernandez said, "Yeah," I said. "And the Greenbrier group. Those are the Greenbrier signatures on the eastern edge." He did not answer. He just kept looking through the binoculars, and that silence was its own answer. I said, "They have been killing each other for 40 years. Hernandez did not say anything to that. There was nothing useful to say. I kept counting. 40, 50. The number kept resolving upward as more signatures emerged from the tree line. By the time the movement stopped, I had counted 62 distinct heat signatures arranged across the valley floor in a rough semicircle facing south, facing the direction the mutant tracks had been heading when we lost them 2 days ago. They knew. That was the thing I could not set down and keep doing my job. They knew they were being hunted. They had communicated that knowledge across territorial boundaries that had been maintained through blood and bone for longer than most human institutions had existed. And then, because they knew, they had made a choice. Not an instinctual choice, not a stimulus-response behavior I could reduce to a line in a field report. A choice. The Cheat River Pack and the Greenbrier Group and at least 2 other territorial units I could not immediately identify were standing in the same valley, in the same freezing dark, shoulder to shoulder, because the alternative was dying alone. I became aware at some point that I had stopped breathing correctly. Hernandez said, very quietly, so quietly I almost lost it to the wind coming through the empty window frame. "You rooting for them?" I did not answer immediately. A professional answer would have been that I maintained no emotional investment in either party to the coming engagement. A true answer was that something had shifted in my chest approximately 90 seconds ago and had not shifted back, and I was not entirely sure it was going to. I said, "Don't ask me that." He said, "I'm asking." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Me too, man. Me too." Below us, the 62 signatures were pacing now. A slow, collective movement, back and forth along their semicircle, that reminded me of something I had seen once at a veterans memorial. That particular quality of stillness and motion combined, either the way people move when they are waiting for something they cannot stop and have decided to meet, standing up. Then the fog at the southern tree line shifted. Not the way fog shifts when wind pushes it. Fog pushed by wind moves in one consistent direction at one consistent speed. This moved in segments, discrete, deliberate, like something very large and very patient rearranging itself behind a curtain. The wolves stopped pacing. Every single one of them stopped at the same moment and faced south. And the valley went so quiet, I could hear Hernandez breathing next to me. And I could hear that he had stopped breathing too. What came out of the fog next is the part I have replayed more times than I can count. Not because I do not remember it clearly. I remember it with a precision that no amount of time has softened. I replay it because I am still, even now, trying to find the moment where a different outcome was possible. I have not found it yet. They did not sneak out of the tree line. That was the first thing that was wrong. The first thing that told me this engagement was going to go the way it went. Everything I had observed about mutant behavior in Montana, in Oregon, in the Cascades, suggested ambush as default. They flanked. They dropped from above. They used darkness and terrain and the specific psychological vulnerability of prey that knows it is being watched but cannot locate the watcher. That was their method. That was what made them effective. These 8 walked out of the southern fog in a straight horizontal line and simply stopped at the valley's edge and stood there in the open, fully visible, and looked at 62 alphas across 120 yards of frozen ground. Through the thermal optics, they were almost invisible. That was the detail that my brain kept returning to even as everything else was happening. Alphas on thermal run hot, brilliant white against the cold background, unmistakable. The 8 registered as a faint gray outline, barely a degree above the ambient temperature of the frozen air. They looked, through the scope, like gaps in the world, like 8 places where the valley had forgotten to exist. Their proportions were wrong in a way that thermal imaging made worse rather than better. Too tall, too narrow through the torso. The limbs slightly too long, jointed at angles that suggested a different gravitational history. They stood without any of the micro movements that living bodies make continuously without knowing it. The small weight shifts, the breath movement in the shoulders, the involuntary adjustments of balance. And they stood the way objects stand, the way a fence post stands. Hernandez said, 8. I said, "I see them." He said, "Brooks, that's 8 against 62. I said, "I know." He said, "They just walked out. They just stood there. They're not even..." He stopped. Then, "They're not scared." I said, "No." He said, "What does that mean?" I did not answer because there was no answer I was willing to say out loud in that moment, and because the megapack had begun to move. The roar that came out of 62 alphas simultaneously was a physical event. It came up through the crane structure, into the cab floor, and into my boots and into my legs. And I felt it in my back teeth. The windows of every derelict structure in that valley that still had glass lost it in that moment. Hernandez grabbed the frame of the window opening next to him without appearing to notice he had done it. The pack charged, 60 bodies hitting frozen ground at full acceleration. The thermal scope filled with white. They crossed the distance in seconds. The 8 gray shapes did not move, did not brace, did not react in any way that I could identify as preparation. And then the distance closed, and the valley became something I can only describe accurately by telling you that I stopped trying to track individual events because individual events were no longer the unit of measure. A gray hand, a white shape spinning, the sound of something structural giving way. A signal flare burst of thermal heat that meant an alpha had gotten its jaws around something and was applying everything it had. A gray shape that simply was not where it had been. An alpha down, then another, the heat signatures blinking out with a speed and regularity that my brain kept trying to reject as a scope malfunction. 2 grays down in the first 90 seconds. Both back on their feet before the 3rd alpha fell. 1 gray sustaining damage that would have ended any biological system I had ever documented and continuing without apparent interruption. The pack folding around them, reforming, folding again. A sound underneath everything that was not roaring and not impact, and not anything I had a category for. 4 minutes. 5. At 6 minutes and some seconds, the last alpha thermal signature went still. And then there was nothing. No movement, no sound. The wind had stopped, or I had stopped being able to hear it. The thermal scope showed 8 faint gray outlines standing in the wreckage of the valley floor, surrounded by 60 cooling white shapes that were already beginning to lose their heat to the January ground. I realized I was still holding my breath from sometime during the 4th minute. I let it out. The silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. They did not leave. I had documented 6 previous mutant engagements across 4 states. In every prior instance, the pattern after elimination was immediate withdrawal. They would finish, and they would go, back into whatever dark geography they had emerged from. And the clearing, or the forest, or the mountain pass would be left with its wreckage and its silence, and nothing else. It was one of the few behavioral consistencies we had logged with confidence. Engage, eliminate, withdraw. These 8 stayed. They moved through the valley floor slowly, without urgency. The way you move through a space you own completely and have no reason to hurry in. I watched through the thermal scope as the first one crouched beside the nearest alpha carcass and did something I cannot describe with full clinical precision even now, because the thermal imaging showed me the effect without showing me the mechanism. What I saw was this. The cooling white shape of the fallen alpha began, very gradually, to transfer. The gray outline of the mutant began to change. It was slow. Horrifyingly slow, in contrast to everything that had preceded it. The frame broadened across the shoulders by what I estimated as 3 to 4 inches over approximately 8 minutes of observation. The limb proportions, already wrong, became more wrong in a different direction. A wrongness that paradoxically looked more capable, more designed. The gray thermal signature, which had registered barely above ambient temperature, began to deepen, to solidify. 2 of the 8 had sustained visible structural damage during the engagement, and 1 missing what the thermal suggested was the lower portion of an arm. Another showing a catastrophic torso wound that should have been a terminal event for any biological system I had ever studied. I watched both wounds close. Not quickly. Slowly, with the same deliberate patience the entire process carried. The tissue rebuilt the way ice forms on still water, gradually, incrementally, until the damage was simply gone. I became aware that I had been narrating none of this into my field recorder. I had stopped narrating approximately 4 minutes into the assimilation and had not noticed. Hernandez had not spoken since I let out my breath. I lowered the scope and looked at him. He was sitting with his back against the cab wall, knees up, rifle across his thighs, looking at the floor of the cab. Not out the window, at the floor, when he had the expression of a man doing very careful, very private arithmetic on something, and not arriving at a number he could live with. I said, "Hernandez." He said, "I keep thinking about the roar." I waited. He said, 62 of them, Brooks. One sound. You feel that? All the way up here through the steel, you felt that. That was everything this region had. Every pack, every territorial line, everything they'd been killing each other over for 40 years. And they just set it down. They set it down and they stood together and they roared, and it didn't matter. It did not matter at all. A few seconds passed. When he spoke again, his voice was level and precise and completely empty of everything that makes a voice sound like its owner is still okay. He said, "We have nothing that can do what those 8 things just did. You know that, right? Not as a tactical problem. I mean, as a..." He stopped, started again. "I mean, there is a math here, Brooks, and I have been running it since the 4th minute down there. And the answer I keep getting is that those things did not come here to live in the woods." I did not say anything. He was not wrong, and we both knew it, and saying so out loud would not change the arithmetic. I raised the scope again. The assimilation was nearly complete. The 8 shapes stood at their full new height in the valley, broader, denser, their thermal signatures registering with a depth and solidity that had not been there before. They stood still for a moment, the way they had stood at the tree line before the charge, that object-like stillness that had nothing to do with rest and everything to do with a complete absence of uncertainty. And then one of them turned its head upward, not scanning, not searching. It turned directly, without any intermediate movement, to the exact angle of the crane cab where Hernandez and I were sitting, and it stopped there. It had no face. The thermal imaging rendered it as a smooth, featureless oval. No eyes, no expression, no structure I could identify as designed for communication. It simply pointed itself at us the way a security camera points at a door. Noting, recording, filing. It held that angle for what my field watch later told me was 11 seconds. Then it turned away, and the 8 of them walked back into the southern fog in the same straight horizontal line they had emerged from. And the valley was empty. Hernandez stood up. He picked up his rifle. He did not say anything as we climbed back down through the coal breaker superstructure and walked to the truck. I did not say anything either. There was a quality to the silence between us that felt load-bearing. Like if either of us spoke, we would have to decide what we actually thought, and neither of us was ready for that yet. We drove for 22 minutes on the county road back toward the interstate. The headlights made a yellow tunnel in the dark, and the dark pressed in from both sides, and I watched the tree line as we passed it, and the tree line gave nothing back. Then Hernandez said, to the windshield, to no one in particular, in the voice of a man stating a fact he wished were a question. It already knew we were there. Neither of us answered that. The heater ran. The tires ran. The dark outside stayed exactly where it was. We stopped for gas outside Beckley at a quick trip that was doing what gas stations do at 2 in the morning, which is exist with a completeness and indifference to context that I found, in that particular moment, almost unbearable to look at directly. I stood under the fluorescent canopy while Hernandez ran the card at the pump, and I watched a man in a Carhartt jacket and unlaced boots come out of the store carrying a 2-liter Mountain Dew and a bag of pork rinds. He walked to a Ford F-150 with a cracked taillight. He got in. He sat there for a moment, eating pork rinds and looking at his phone with the particular relaxed contentment of a man whose night contained nothing more urgent than deciding whether to drive home now or in 10 minutes. 2 pumps over, a couple in a Subaru were laughing about something. The woman's laugh coming through the closed window has a muffled brightness, her hand on the driver's arm. The gas station sign hummed above all of it, in the specific frequency of a thing that has been humming for so long, it no longer notices itself. I thought about 62 thermal signatures cooling into the January ground of a coal valley 40 miles north. I thought about 11 seconds. I went inside and bought 2 coffees I did not taste, and we drove the rest of the way to the interstate without speaking. The briefing happened 4 days later in a secure conference room in a building in Northern Virginia that I am not going to name or locate more precisely than that. There were 9 people in the room. Dr. Aris presented the population data from a laptop connected to a wall screen, and the data said what we already knew it would say, which is that the alpha population across the contiguous United States had flatlined, not declined, not critically reduced, gone. The tracking grid showed a continent that had been emptied of its apex predators in approximately 6 weeks, and what had emptied it was still out there, continent-wide, its own population expanding in direct proportion to what it had consumed. Aris had the particular energy of a man who had prepared very carefully for a presentation he desperately wished he did not have to give. He walked through the data methodically, answered 3 clarifying questions in a voice stripped of everything except the facts, and then sat down and looked at the table. The deputy director, a man named Caulfield, who had been in his position for 11 years and who wore his authority the way some men wear an expensive watch, constant and unremarked upon, leaned forward and said, "So, what are we recommending as next steps?" It was not a question. It was the sound of an institution reaching for a familiar shape in the dark. Aris said, "I'm not sure next steps is the right frame, sir." Caulfield said, "It is always the right frame. What do we have in terms of interdiction capability, containment options? What are the tactical people telling us about engagement parameters going forward?" Aris looked at him for a moment. Then he said carefully, "The way you speak to someone standing on something that will not hold their weight. Sir, in Fayette County, 8 entities eliminated 62 alphas in 6 minutes. And the alphas had a combined territorial range of approximately 4,000 square miles and represented the peak of 40 years of apex biological development in the Appalachian region." Caulfield said, "Right." Aris said, "We have nothing in our interdiction inventory that an alpha pack could not destroy in under 2 minutes." The room was quiet. Caulfield clicked his pen twice and wrote something on his legal pad that I could not read from where I was sitting and said, "Let's get the tactical people on a call this week and see what options exist that we haven't fully scoped yet." I wrote nothing in my notebook during the entire briefing. I had not written anything since Fayette County. The page was blank, and I kept looking at it and thinking about the thing Hernandez had said to the windshield. In about 11 seconds, I said about the man in the Quick Trip parking lot eating pork rinds in his truck with no idea that the fence around his world had just come down. I did not say a single word in that meeting. What I did not say was, "There are no options." What I did not say was, "They already know where we are." What I did not say was, "We have been noted, filed, and found insufficient." I drove home in the dark. The lucky fish in the hat looked down at me from the sun visor the whole way. I had not spoken to my daughter in 11 days, and I did not call her that night, because I did not yet know how to be her father and know what I knew at the same time. and I was not sure those two things were ever going to be compatible again. If you are reading this, then the USB drive made it. I want to be honest with you about what this document is and what it is not. It is not a field report. I have written enough field reports to know what they sound like, and they do not sound like this. They do not use words like grief or lucky fish or unbearable. They do not address the reader directly. They do not admit that the author has not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in the 6 weeks since Fayette County, or that he has started parking his truck facing outward in every parking lot he uses, or that he looks at tree lines now or the way you look at a face you do not fully trust. This is not a field report. This is a man telling you something true because the institution he worked for has decided that the truth is a liability. And he has decided, somewhat late in the timeline, that he disagrees. So let me tell you what I actually believe in plain language, without the qualifications and passive constructions and carefully managed ambiguities that 9 years in federal service taught me to use as a first language. I believe the alphas were not incidental to what is coming. I believe they were the specific, necessary first phase of something that was designed before it arrived here. Something that understood this continent's biological architecture well enough to know exactly which load-bearing walls to remove before it started on the rest of the structure. The alphas were not prey. They were a resource, a construction material. And the construction is finished now, which means the project has moved to its next phase, and the next phase is us. I believe the 8 things in the valley knew we were in that crane cab from the moment we climbed into it. I believe they knew before that. I believe the GPS anomaly at Dyer's Cut was not a technical artifact, and the 9-degree temperature differential was not an atmospheric condition, and the ranger's face at the station on the access road was the face of someone who had already, on some wordless animal level, understood that something had changed in the architecture of the world she lived in, and had not yet found the language for it. I have been thinking about the look for 6 weeks. The 11 seconds. The featureless head turning to the exact angle of the cab, without searching, without scanning, with the immediate precision of something that had known our coordinates the entire time and was choosing, in that moment, not to simply confirm that we knew it knew. I told myself, on the drive home, and in the briefing room, and in the following days when I was still trying to do my job as though my job still meant something, that the look was indifference, that we were beneath consideration, that the most terrifying thing about those 11 seconds was that we did not matter. I do not believe that anymore. I think the look was a message. I think something that crossed however many light years in a delivery vehicle disguised as a meteorite and spent 6 weeks systematically dismantling the apex biological infrastructure of an entire continent does not do anything accidentally, including turning its head toward a crane cab for 11 seconds before walking away. I think it was telling us it was ready. I think it was telling us it was our turn. Here is what I need you to do with this document. Not the people who will try to contain it, not the people in the Northern Virginia conference room who are still scheduling calls with the tactical team to scope options that do not exist. You, the person listening to this right now, in whatever ordinary place you are sitting, with whatever ordinary thing you were doing before you pressed play. Remember the quick trip. Remember the man with the Mountain Dew and the couple in the Subaru and the sign humming its single, indifferent note above all of it. Remember what it felt like to hear about them and understand that they did not know. Hold that feeling somewhere specific and do not let it go, because that feeling is the most honest thing I have to give you. The fence is down. Whatever was being kept out is not being kept out anymore. I mailed the USB drive this morning. I used a return address that does not exist. I am sitting in my truck in a parking lot in Morgantown, facing outward, with the lucky fish looking down at me from the sun visor. And I am going to call my daughter now because I have decided that not knowing how to be both things at once is no longer an acceptable reason to not be either of them. This file was never supposed to exist. I made it exist anyway, because someone has to. And because there is a case file sitting in a server in Northern Virginia labeled simply Cass County. And if anyone in the agency had been paying attention to what was happening in the Lake District of Northern Michigan 2 months before the first meteorite hit, none of us would have been surprised by anything that came after. Find Cass County. If you made it this far, then you already know what kind of channel this is. Subscribe. The Cass County file is coming. If this document reached you through someone else, share it. That is how the truth moves now. Leave a comment with one word. What you think the look meant.